podcast, The Future of Hong Kong, featuring Dr. Jennifer Staats. Jennifer Staats is the East and Southeast Asian Director for the United States Institute of Peace. I'm Paul Quinn. I'm a board member at the World Affairs Council of West Michigan. And on behalf of my colleagues, Erica, Emily, and Michael, I welcome all of you. And thanks for adjusting with us in this new world as we program responsibly in the time of COVID. We hope you will all stay safe and show grace to those in your community. The Council's mission is to empower the people and organizations of West Michigan to engage thoughtfully with the world. We do this with the support of 50 local companies, 11 educational partners, and many community members. Together, we seek to provide programming that is credible, objective, relevant, civil, and compelling. To change the world, we believe that one must first know the world. You can learn more at worldmichigan.org. Our format for today is straightforward. We'll hear about Hong Kong, the general region of East and Southeast Asia from Dr. Staats, and then open things up for questions. You can type questions into your YouTube comments section or text them to 616-308-6560. Remember our house rules. Be respectful and be succinct. So let me introduce Dr. Jennifer Staats to you. As I mentioned, she is Director of East and Southeast Asia for the United States Institute of Peace. She joined the USIP in 2016 and is Director of the China Program. She continues to lead USIP's work on China and its impact on peace and security around the world. She also oversees USIP's program in Myanmar, as well as the Institute's work on in Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, and Oceania. Dr. Staats previously spent several years working in the office of the Secretary of Defense, where she concentrated on policy issues related to Asia. She also served as director in the Cyber Policy Office and managed the Asian Pacific Security Affairs portfolio for the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Legislative Affairs. Before entering government service, Jennifer was a fellow with the International Security Program at Harvard's Belfer Center. She received her doctorate from Harvard and her master's from Princeton and her bachelor's from the University of the South. So Jennifer, welcome to the conversation. Thanks for sharing your time and expertise with us. So viewers, again, you may type your questions in into the YouTube comment section or text them to 616-308-6560. So with that, Jennifer, let's kick the conversation off and talk about Hong Kong and Asia. So welcome.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for having me. Good evening. Again, my name is Jennifer Staats, and I am joining you tonight from Washington, D.C. But I have to say I was born and raised in the Midwest, next door in central Illinois. My sister actually lived in Holland, Michigan for 8 years. So Western Michigan, especially Tulip Time and the Flying Dutch, have a special place in my heart. And it's really great to be back with you all tonight. I've been asked to talk about Hong Kong and particularly the new national security legislation introduced by Beijing this summer. But before I dive into that, I actually want to spend just a minute telling you about the United States Institute of Peace, where I work. USIP was founded by Congress in 1984 as a national, independent, nonpartisan institute. You probably know that America has military academies, but did you know that we also have a peace institute? That's us. We do, and we work around the world to learn more about how to prevent and manage conflict. And we work with people living in conflict-affected countries around the globe in their efforts to build sustaining peace. We're an independent organization, but we are, as I said, founded by Congress, and we are funded by the US government. So I wanted to take this opportunity to tell you a little bit more about what we do. I can do that. I'm actually going to try to show you a short video because I think that can do it more effectively than I can. And with any luck, I will get the technology to work, and we'll watch that here for just 1 second. Let me see. Should go. It's not going on my end. All right, it's not working on my end, so I try one more time, and if not, we'll just let it pass. All right, I'm not sure what's happened there. That's okay. We'll move ahead. Sorry, go ahead. Were you gonna say something, Paul? You're muted.
If they want to learn more about your organization, what website should I go to?
Absolutely, happy to, that's exactly where I was going next. So you can go to usip.org to learn more. And again, I think it's exciting. Part of our mission as an institute is to not only do our work in Washington and do our work around the world, but take our work and share that with people across the United States. And so that's partly why it's so fun to be with you tonight. But also, I hope that you will take advantage of some of the resources on our website, everything from access to all of our events, but also some of our reports and research that we've done. There's also free courses on peace building and conflict management and conflict analysis that might be useful, as well as a ton of resources for students in schools of almost every age. So I really hope that you will take advantage of that and reach out to me or others at the Institute if you have any questions or if there's more that we can do there. So anyway, sorry about the tech, but anyway, we'll keep on plowing through. So again, my remarks tonight will focus on the new national security legislation that was imposed by Beijing in Hong Kong back on June 30th. Looking first at how we got here, and then talking a little bit about what has changed in Hong Kong over the last 3 months as a result of that law. Then I'll spend a little time at the end talking about what that means for the United States and for the rest of the region. So as most of you know, Hong Kong has actually been a British colony since 1842, and Kowloon went under British control in 1860. And finally, in 1898, China leased the last remaining bit of what is now Hong Kong, the new territories, to Britain for 99 years. And over this time, Hong Kong remained legally outside of China. It had its own political and economic system, its own culture, its own currency, its own language. You know, throughout World War II, there was pressure on Britain to return Hong Kong to China. Churchill was steadfastly opposed to that. But then in the mid-70s, China and Britain again began discussions about the future of Hong Kong's status. Official negotiations began in 1982, and the Sino-British Joint Declaration was signed in 1984. And that agreement set the stage for Britain to withdraw from Hong Kong in 1997 on July 1st at the end of the 99-year lease. And at that point, Hong Kong would go under Chinese control, but it would retain its special status for another 50 years. And during that time, Hong Kong was supposed to remain autonomous. It would have its own constitution, its own basic law to protect its self-rule, its autonomy, and its way of life. So during this time, it's had its own independent judicial powers, its own executive and legislative systems. And then again, in 2047, it would go entirely under PRC control. Today, Hong Kong has more than 7 million people. It's the leading financial center of Asia, with most of the world's major banks and multinational firms basing their regional headquarters there. I'm sure a lot of you have been there. It's a fascinating city and has a lot, its own special spirit and character based on its history and the way that life there has evolved over the last 100 years. Now, you know, back when the Sino-British Joint Declaration was signed back in the early 80s, China was really just beginning to open up to the world. And at that time, many assumed that by 2047, when Hong Kong returned to mainland Chinese control, China would be much more open and free and democratic, like Hong Kong. But as we've seen, that wasn't really the case. And over the last 10 years in particular, China has moved in the opposite direction, becoming much more authoritarian and far less open. And despite the promise of one country, two systems that Hong Kong was supposed to enjoy until 2047, Beijing has lately been taking steps to squeeze the city, to reduce its autonomy and squelch its democracy and the freedoms that it was supposed to be enjoying throughout this 50-year period. Today, Hong Kong is governed by the Basic Law, which is essentially its constitution, that protects rights like freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, and sets out the governance for the territory. And that essentially dictates, again, how Hong Kong is ruled. It's run by a chief executive with support from a formal body of advisors called the Executive Council. That chief executive is responsible for implementing the Basic Law, signing all the bills and budgets, making laws, and putting them into effect for Hong Kong. Now, the Basic Law did not give Hong Kong a pure democracy. The chief executive is not directly elected by the people, but is selected every 5 years by an election committee that's made up of representatives from the main professional sectors across Hong Kong. And in order to be considered on the slate of candidates for chief executive, the person first has to be approved by Beijing. Beijing has control over the political system in other ways as well. For example, all proposed changes to the political process in Hong Kong must be approved, not just by the Hong Kong authorities, but also by Beijing. And Beijing also has the final say in interpreting Hong Kong's constitution, the basic law. And over the last few years has also really gained control over the media environment, which has had a big impact on the political discussion there. Hong Kong is allowed to have its own foreign policy in some areas, like trade and communications, but Beijing maintains control over the city's defense and has a military garrison in central Hong Kong. Now, despite all of this and this kind of strange mix of political systems, Hong Kong has undoubtedly enjoyed a number of freedoms that have really set it apart from the mainland. Again, as I said, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, but Beijing has been taking steps to limit those freedoms and trying to draw Hong Kong closer into its orbit and more enmeshed with the Chinese mainland. This has not been sitting well with Hong Kongers, who have grown quite accustomed to things like self-rule and rule of law. And it's, I think, particularly difficult for the youth in Hong Kong, who have grown up in a society that is very different from what they see across the border in mainland China. Now, since the handover in 1997, Hong Kongers have really been pushing back against being fully absorbed into mainland China. Most of them haven't been pushing for independence per se, but really just want to make sure that that one country, two system compromise or promise is being upheld and that their way of life that they have worked so hard to keep is being protected. Now, remember, Hong Kongers can't directly elect their officials, so they have found other ways to make their voices heard. And they have really embraced protests as a key tool for expressing their views and really pressing the government to listen. Much of this, of course, would not be possible in mainland China. For example, since 1990, Hong Kong has held an annual candlelight vigil every June 4th to commemorate the massacre at Tiananmen Square. There is no recognition or commemoration of June 4th anywhere in mainland China, but the largest vigil in the world is held right next door in Hong Kong. And there have been a series of protests over the last 20 years or so, pushing back against policies that Hong Kongers felt were really too oppressive. I'll talk about a few of them. I won't go through all of them because there are a lot. The first big protests I'll talk about were in 2003, when the government proposed a new law that would prohibit acts of subversion against China. And there was another big one in 2012, when Beijing tried to impose patriotic education reforms in Hong Kong that would change the Hong Kong school curriculum in ways that would put it in line with Beijing's preferred version of history. Now, that 2012 movement was the experience that really introduced the world to some of the most recognizable faces in the Hong Kong protest. Primarily a group of high school students, which you've probably seen, and the most recognizable is probably Joshua Wong, who really had a leadership role in that protest, helping to organize more than 100,000 people in the streets to oppose that movement. They occupied the Hong Kong government complex, and eventually their efforts led to the withdrawal of those proposed curriculum reforms. There was another big protest in 2014 when Hong Kongers took to the streets demanding universal suffrage and the right to elect their own leaders. At that point, again, they occupied the streets around government buildings and the financial center and essentially brought Hong Kong to a standstill for about 79 days until the police moved them out. This got worldwide media attention, and you probably know it as the umbrella movement and have seen the pictures of all of the students in the square using their umbrellas as shields against police pepper spray.
So Jennifer,
yes,
if I could jump in there for a second. Does the USIP, do you think China is within their rights to do this?
Well, that's a big discussion, and we'll get to that in a minute as we get to the real crackdown on what's happened over the last year. I think what you're hearing from Beijing is that it is fully within their legal role and responsibilities as the final interpreter of the basic law to decide what is best for the city, and does so obviously in consultation with the Hong Kong authorities, but has a justification for why all of these things are being done. And I think that is particularly true, as we'll get to in just a minute, with the conversations about last year and this year.
Perfect.
So again, to cut ahead, the 2019 protests, I think, in 2019, Beijing once again really pushed Hong Kong too far. That summer, hundreds of thousands protested against a proposal that would allow legal extraditions from Hong Kong to mainland China. This went on for months, and there were some really striking photos, again, of protesters breaking into the Legislative Council building, occupying the airport, and again, really kind of shutting down the city. And the protesters claimed that they had 5 demands, not one less. The first, of course, was this withdrawal of the extradition bill, which finally was withdrawn, and it was actually the only demand that was really met of those 5. They also wanted an independent commission of inquiry into allegations of police brutality, which I'll talk about in a second. Classification of protesters as rioters, they wanted that removed so that they couldn't be punished or tried under that classification. They wanted amnesty for those arrested protesters, and they were really pushing for universal suffrage. So as you know, in the last half of last year, millions of people took to the streets. Initially, the protests were peaceful, almost remarkably so. But then things started to get more violent. The police really cracked down hard, trying to put an end to all of this. They used digital surveillance, facial recognition, GPS trackers to try to figure out who was involved in the protests and arrest them. They fired rubber bullets and tear gas at the protesters, and then ultimately started to use live ammunition. The protesters fought back, again, with their own shields, but then ultimately with homemade explosives and rocks. And things were really getting out of control. And I think that was the pretense for, again, more aggressive action from the government. The protesters complained about excessive use of force, but then Carrie Lam, the chief executive, said she fully supported the police and started to label the protesters as terrorists. And that dynamic really became problematic as the people versus police confrontation grew. Since June of last year, over 8,000 people have been arrested, but no police have been prosecuted, which is a big problem and complaint of the protesters, obviously. As I said, that extradition legislation was withdrawn in September, but the protests continued for a variety of reasons. And there's a lot of electoral drama built into all of this. I'll skip a little bit, but I think things calmed down a fair bit during COVID-19, just because people were wanting to be outside in big crowds in the street. But again, I think there were several arrests in April, and then people went out again in protest, and things never really fully died down. This really took a toll on Taiwan, or I'm sorry, not on Taiwan, on Hong Kong. The economy slowed, tourism really slowed, and there was just tremendous civil unrest and political instability in the city. And, by this year, Beijing was frankly getting really tired of it. It was really worried about the negative impact these protests were having, but it was also worried about the message that this pro-democracy movement was sending in mainland China to others who might see what was happening and decide that they also wanted democracy. And so they really cracked down pretty hard as a signal to others that they really shouldn't challenge Beijing, they shouldn't challenge the Communist Party. And so on June 30th, essentially to try to reimpose order in a city that had become quite disorderly, Chinese officials announced a new national security law that would go into effect the very next day. People sort of thought it might be coming, but the text had been kept secret and it caught everyone by surprise, and that it came so quickly, and that the language was so extreme. And again, they justified this saying that it needed to be done, that it wasn't intended to punish a lot of people, but was really supposed to be a deterrent against rioters and against destructive protesters to try to get life back to normal. So the law, the new national security legislation, defines crimes as terrorism, subversion, secession, and collusion with foreign powers. But it defines them very broadly and makes it really easy for authorities to use these crimes as justification to crack down on almost anyone at once. These are tools that Beijing has long used in mainland China to crack down on activists and dissidents, and they now can do the same thing in Hong Kong. Once you're arrested, there's really no rule of law that applies. Instead of trying the case in Hong Kong courts, There's a separate legal system that's been set up to use for the most serious cases. And notably, this law applies to everyone. So it's not just residents of Hong Kong, but anyone anywhere in the world that can be found in violation of this new law. So journalists, researchers, lawmakers, everyday people from any country in the world can be accused of violating the law with a maximum sentence of life in prison. Now, there's still no formal extradition treaty from Hong Kong to Beijing. That was the main source of the protest last year. But the new law does say that in cases that are particularly important or complex, defendants can be taken to mainland China for trial. Now, all of this is pretty strong and essentially ends many of the freedoms that Hong Kongers have enjoyed for so long. It ends freedom of speech, makes it a crime to question or challenge the government. And in many ways, one country, two systems that was supposed to last until 2047 has essentially ended. And there's a great fear that Hong Kong will now essentially just look like any other city in China, and perhaps with even greater restrictions as Beijing really tries to send a message about its intentions. So that was 3 months ago on the dot, actually. So I'll talk a little bit about what's happened since then. Not surprisingly, there's been a further crackdown on protesters. Hong Kongers went to the streets on July 1st in protest, the day the law went into effect. Hundreds were arrested right away, and 10 were accused right out of the gate of violating the new law. Some of the student-led protests continued, and the police continued to use tear gas and other means of force against them. Just today, in fact, it's Chinese National Day, and there are plans for a peaceful protest in downtown Hong Kong in one of the very busy tourist sections. And the police were there in full force. If you could see some of the pictures in the press, really cordoning people off with riot gear and ready to crack down. And they arrested 60 people today in conjunction with that. And really many of the people in Hong Kong who have been active in the pro-democracy movements over the last few years have left Hong Kong, fearing for their own safety, trying to avoid being arrested under the new law. There have been a number of high-profile arrests of those who have stayed, including, as you may have seen, media mogul Jimmy Lai, who was arrested again. He's been arrested several times this year in violation of these laws, as well as student leaders Joshua Wong and Agnes Chow. And actually, just a few weeks ago, there were 12 democracy activists who were trying to flee Hong Kong in a speedboat on their way to Taiwan, who were detained for illegally crossing the border. They had all been arrested before in conjunction with these Hong Kong protests, and China has now declared them separatists, and they're being held in mainland China and have been formally arrested under Chinese law. Hong Kong, as I said, this applies globally. So Hong Kong has also issued arrest warrants for democracy and human rights advocates around the world, including a US citizen, Daniel Chu, who's the head of the Washington-based Hong Kong Democracy Council, as well as Nathan Law, who's a former student protest leader who is now seeking asylum in the UK. Beijing and the Hong Kong authorities have cracked down in other ways. They have deemed a number of pro-democracy candidates ineligible for office. Many of the political parties have been disbanded. They really cracked down on a primary election that was held in July and said that it was against the law, and anyone who went ahead and voted and participated in this election would be in violation of the law. Hong Kongers in true form showed up. Over 600,000 people voted anyway, and the pro-democracy candidates did very, very well. But unfortunately, the authorities later banned many of them from participating in the election. That election was supposed to be held in September, but the authorities postponed it for an entire year, claiming that that was because of COVID concerns. Many have pushed back, saying that it's possible to have an election during COVID and to do so safely, and are warning that this move will push Hong Kong into a real constitutional crisis. As you might expect, there's been a crackdown on free speech. Books that have been deemed to be in violation of the law have been removed from libraries and bookstores. The police now have control of deciding who is an accredited journalist, which is causing a lot of concern that journalist outlets who are critical of Beijing or just impartial may no longer be allowed to operate in quite the same way. The economy has obviously suffered. Many businesses and media outlets are relocating their headquarters out of Hong Kong into other parts of Asia. The New York Times, for example, moved its headquarters to Seoul, and there are a number of tech companies moving data storage out of Hong Kong to other places that are really outside the reach of the Chinese Communist Party. The American Chamber of Commerce surveyed a number of businesses in Hong Kong and found that nearly 40% of its members who are in Hong Kong now are planning to move capital or assets or operations outside of the city. I think this is particularly tough for a lot of the tech firms. The new law gives police the authority to ask these companies to delete data or restrict access to content that they think is a threat to national security. So a number of companies that operate in Hong Kong but are banned in mainland China, companies like Google, Facebook, Twitter, are all blocking authorities from accessing their user data now, but I think really trying to figure out how long they can hold that position and what their future will look like in Hong Kong. The global response to all of this has been pretty interesting. Not surprisingly, as I said, Beijing has called Hong Kong protesters terrorists and has said that this brutal crackdown was really necessary to preserve peace and to save lives. China has also blamed the US, the UK, Taiwan, and others being the black hand behind this and covertly inciting and organizing the protests. But I really think that's not fair to the brave people of Hong Kong who have really just shown incredible bravery and toughness and passion and creativity in the face of this threat and these changes, and certainly didn't need any help from us. The United States has introduced a number of sweeping policy changes in response to all of this. In July, President Trump signed the Hong Kong Autonomy Act that called for sanctions against anyone who's contributed to the erosion of Hong Kong's authority. He also signed an executive order that ended the special status that Hong Kong has enjoyed under US law. So essentially, Hong Kong is now being treated the same as mainland China. In August, the Treasury Department levied sanctions on 11 Hong Kong officials, including Carrie Lam, the chief executive. And then in retaliation for that, China imposed similar sanctions or measures on 11 Americans, including 5 members of Congress and the heads of several pro-democracy NGOs in the United States. Several countries have abrogated their extradition treaties with Hong Kong, and the US has also imposed an arms embargo. The UK's response has also been interesting. I mean, I think the UK's role in all of this, it has a special relationship with Hong Kong, given its history. And it has announced that those who really are affected by this new law have a way out and a route out of Hong Kong to the UK. There are 350,000 people in Hong Kong that already have what they call a British national overseas, a BNO passport, which was offered to Hong Kong residents in the city in 1997 when it was handed over from Britain to China. So they are able to travel to the UK visa-free for 6 months. And this new arrangement that's been proposed would allow those BNO holders and their dependents to move to the UK for 5 years. And then to stay, if they stay for a 6th year, they can apply for citizenship in the UK. The last country I'll talk about, or the last effect, I guess, in the region that I'll talk about is really that of Taiwan, which has been affected by all of this in a really interesting way. The current president, Tsai Ing-wen, was trailing in the polls last year when she was up for re-election. But after the crackdown in Hong Kong, she became much more popular than her opponent, who favored closer ties to Beijing. She easily won re-election in January, likely because many in Taiwan looked at what was happening in Hong Kong and were worried that the PRC would try to take a similar hard line against Taiwan. Several hundred people did leave Hong Kong for Taiwan, and when that law went into effect, Taiwan opened up a special office to try to help them find jobs and really make the transition to life in Taiwan. But then, when the new law was passed, it really increased the stakes and changed the game a little bit. So it's been accusing Taiwan of harboring criminals, including with anti-Chinese forces, and has said, that, quote, any actions that bring chaos to Hong Kong or seek independence will be severely punished by the law. So this makes things a little bit more complicated for the authorities in Taiwan. They certainly want to support those who are fleeing Hong Kong, but this is all happening against a backdrop of really increased tensions between Taiwan and mainland China, where the risk of military conflict has been increasing in recent months. And there are many who fear that Beijing may use military force to try to send that strong signal to Taiwan that it shouldn't try to seek or declare its own independence right now. So Taiwan has been offering quiet humanitarian assistance to protesters, but not really saying a whole lot more than that about what it's doing to try to keep everybody out of trouble. But there are many in Taiwan who are pushing the government to do more to try to help Hong Kong and have called for legislation that would actually guarantee refuge to Hong Kong citizens who try to flee Hong Kong for Taiwan. And then the last bit I'll talk about is, not country specific, but just the effect that all of these changes and changes in Chinese behavior are having on global conversations about human rights. Over the last 2 years, there have really been two blocks that have emerged in these global conversations about human rights. And these divisions are really most evident in the ways that these different blocks have been talking about China's human rights policies. The first block is really made up of largely democratic states that condemns China's policies in Hong Kong and Xinjiang and elsewhere. And then there's a second group, which is largely made up of autocratic states that is speaking out in support of China's behavior, defending Beijing's sovereignty and its right to do as it wishes within its borders without any criticism from the outside. So there's been kind of this, we could talk about this more in the Q&A if it's of interest, but this interesting pattern and back and forth where, the first block will issue a letter condemning Chinese behavior, and then shortly thereafter, the other block will issue a letter defending Chinese behavior. And this kind of goes back and forth on a range of issues. It is, it's interesting to think about why some of these countries might be supporting this new law or supporting Beijing in its efforts here. Some certainly see this as a way to strengthen their relationship with Beijing and get, whether it's political favor or economic favor, but really prioritizing that relationship. For others, I think supporting this legislation really gives them, their leaders at home, a little more space to implement similar laws and do similar things. Notably, as I said, a lot of these states are really autocratic. More than half that are supporting this new national security legislation in Hong Kong have been deemed not free by Freedom House and have their own human rights challenges. So really, in a way, supporting Beijing gives them a fair bit of cover and protection against similar criticism for their own policies at home. So really, I think this is having a broader impact in the way that this is reverberating in these conversations on some of these conversations about universal human rights and about the ways that democratic systems differ and, as the first block would assert, are better than more authoritarian systems. At the same time, it's really lowering expectations for a lot of these countries, giving them more space, again, to limit political and civil liberties, and do so by sort of pointing to Beijing and noting that it's okay for China to do it, so it must be okay for me to do it as well. And I think this really makes it a lot harder for the US or the UN or others to then try to challenge China on some of these policies that, particularly human rights policies, that we find problematic. But I think also makes it harder then to really raise those issues in other countries and in other situations where we might want to try to influence that or try to help and protect political civil liberties where they're not being protected. So where do we go from here? Fortunately, I'm out of time, so I don't have a whole lot to go into on that. But I will note that, as Beijing really tightens its grip around Hong Kong, it's hard to imagine how the city is going to reclaim all of the freedoms that it used to enjoy and that spirit and autonomy that has really given Hong Kong such a unique character over the last several decades. But that said, I will never underestimate the bravery and creativity and resolve of the Hong Kong people. They have repeatedly surprised us and surpassed expectations with their commitment to their city, their way of life, and their fellow citizens. So I think the jury is still out, but I think right now, there are a lot of people, a lot of families, a lot of companies really trying to figure out what this means for them. And I'm sure that will be something that we talk about in Q&A. So I really, again, it's wonderful to be with you. I really look forward to your comments and your questions. And yes, I'm looking forward to a good discussion. Thanks.
So with that, thank you, Jennifer, for that phenomenal synopsis. Again, I'd like to remind everybody that you can type your comments and questions into the YouTube comments section, or you can text your questions to 616-308-6560. But with that, we have a question that came in from Tim Liang, and his question is centered around China's greater macro plan for the entire Pearl River Delta, Macau, including Hong Kong. What do you think China's ultimate macro intention is for this entire geography?
I mean, I think China's goal, again, is territorial sovereignty and really bringing all of that, harnessing all of that economic power and potential into mainland China. I think, what you've seen over the last few years in terms of, again, policies, political policies, economic policies, cultural policies to try to really tie all these areas closer to the mainland. I think this is clearly, the way Beijing wants this to unfold and expects that it will. Seeing some of these, as I said, infrastructure projects, these enormous bridges and roads and construction projects that are really just, physically tying these areas together and breaking down a lot of those barriers will, over time, I think, by really bringing people together from all those different areas, try to, again, break down not just the geographic barriers, but also the political and cultural barriers as well.
Yeah, it's interesting that Beijing is putting so much pressure on Hong Kong. There's no shortage of deep water ports on China's shoreline, but there are shortages of places where you can do US dollar commerce freely, and Hong Kong is certainly that place. So it surprises me that Beijing is taking this tact with Hong Kong, because the effects of banking and finance moving offshore are certainly going to be detrimental to trade. We have another question that is coming in from our audience. Where do you see companies migrating their businesses, their manufacturing operations, their headquarters to within Southeast Asia?
That's a good question. I think, and I don't have a firm answer to that. Paul, I'd actually be interested in hearing your thoughts on this. I think there's certainly competition for that. I think as supply lines change and people start to rethink their presence in mainland China for political but also economic reasons, that there clearly has been a movement. You've seen concentrated efforts out of places like Japan to try to change their supply chains and change the way that their companies do business, and certainly a lot of countries in Southeast Asia that are eager for that business to come their way. There's a lot of political instability in a number of places right now, and especially with COVID, I think a lot of questions about how some of these countries are going to come out of this, again, both economically and politically. But Paul, I'd be really interested in your thoughts if you have predictions on where that's going to go.
I absolutely think that Singapore, for professional services, banking, and finance, Singapore is the obvious choice. The legal system there is similar to Hong Kong. US dollars can move freely. It's a currency hub. So to me, that is a logical choice. For manufacturing, I think that the initial response for a lot of companies involved in China, it was Vietnam, but the capacity quickly got taken up in Vietnam, and now they're exploring Malaysia. They're exploring Thailand, and maybe even a little bit in Taiwan. So I think that there are certainly different countries where they can move their manufacturing operations, but I think the recipient of the financial entities is going to be Singapore. Japan would love to compete for it, but as you know, there's still a language barrier in Japan. In Singapore, you can do business in English. And it's very easy to do business in Singapore, and they make it very accommodating, not just from a legal standpoint, but from a tax standpoint too. I would be curious to hear your thoughts on, U.S. companies that have operations in Hong Kong. I don't see the immediate need to flee, but certainly, this changes the thought trajectory going forward, right? But do you think that that sense of urgency should be sped up? I mean, should U.S. companies, in particular Michigan companies, be not thinking about this in the next 2 years, but maybe 1 year? How should they think about this on a timeline?
Sorry, thanks. I've got kids right outside the door.
Oh,
I mean, I think we don't know. And again, as we were talking earlier, it's hard to know exactly how this rule is going to be implemented and enforced and how companies will need to respond to that. I think the Beijing authorities, the Hong Kong authorities have been clear that, this isn't intended to, dramatically change the behavior of everyone who lives in Hong Kong or does business or operates in Hong Kong. It's really designed to, address this immediate need of trying to bring peace and security and stability back to the streets, to put an end to the protests, to try to get people back into their regular way of life. Now, and if people can do that, and there's sort of a peaceful, return to that status quo, then you may not hear a whole lot about this. Now, that said, I think the fact that this law is now in place, and again, Beijing can interpret the law and interpret the basic law as it wishes, means that it does have the tools to crack down on anyone kind of at any time in any way, because of the way that all of this is structured. It's built itself enough support in the legal system to do that. So, I think there's probably going to be a lot of hesitancy to move right away until people see exactly how this is going to be implemented. But there's sort of talk about the anaconda and the chandelier, and the fact that just the threat of it being there, and the threat of the potential crackdown may be enough to get people to change their behavior or to ultimately to leave.
yeah. What recourse do you think Hong Kong has? Can they appeal to the UN? Can they've obviously appealed to countries like us. I agree with you. I'm surprised that the UK is not more involved. They should be. I mean, they set the table for all this. But so do they have recourse beyond the United States? Can they lean on the UN? Is there something that could potentially happen there?
They can ask for support, certainly, and I think they are getting that. And again, I think a lot of people were caught off guard and are trying to figure out exactly how to respond. And certainly in countries like the United States, these efforts, there have been a number of bills proposed, but they take their time to work their way through the system. So it may just take a while for some countries and systems to really respond in a meaningful way to what is happening. But that said, it's really hard to imagine how any outside country would really push back against this. I mean, I think given the structure, given the way that the basic law is written, and given the influence that Beijing has, I'm not really sure what recourse they have, other than kind of hoping that everyone's going to operate in good faith through 2047. But do you have thoughts on that? Do you see levers that could be pulled, or pressure points that might be utilized here?
It's in the form of the US dollar reserve sitting in Hong Kong. I think that is one big pressure point that will get Beijing's attention. If those dollars start to migrate away to Singapore, to Tokyo, or to London, or back to the US, I think that will get Beijing's attention. I'm surprised that more hasn't fled the Hong Kong region. We have some questions coming in from the audience. This is again from Tim Liang. How does the US taking away Hong Kong's special status and special privileges help Chinese citizens?
How does it help Chinese citizens?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I'm guessing some of this answer may come again in your area of expertise on the financial side of things, because I think, really, it more than anything, I think it removes those kind of buttressing factors that made Hong Kong so unique and gave people the incentive to choose to do business in Hong Kong, as opposed to doing it in mainland China. And again, I think for a long time, Hong Kong's had one of the freest economies in the world. And, I think people knew that was likely going to end, and obviously it was going to change with the handover, but this certainly expedites that. So I think, really changing the special status or taking away the special status and treating Hong Kong like we treat the mainland, again, I think that the benefit is likely on the financial side in terms of what that means for Beijing, but in terms of what that means for the average Chinese citizen, I don't know. It's a really good question. I'll give it more thought, but I'm curious your
It is.
take on that.
It is an interesting question because it makes you think whether China's ultimate goal here is to bring the financial center of Asia back to Shanghai, where it was a long time ago. Maybe there's a little bit of jealousy in that the success of Hong Kong as a financial center, and maybe China would like to see that come back to Shanghai. I don't think this is the way to get that to come back to Shanghai, but they might be thinking along those lines.
Can I just?
Another.
I think there's.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I think there's still. I think everyone's trying to understand exactly why Beijing took this step now and what it ultimately wants to get out of this reabsorption of Hong Kong. And I think there is an active debate about how much of it really is financially driven and what role that component plays. And there's been talk if these protests completely destroy the Hong Kong economy, is China really going to care that much about bringing it back into the fold right away, or does that sort of lessen its value in some way for Beijing? And so I think that there's sort of a debate as to whether this is really financially driven and how much that's affecting the equation and the decision making in Beijing, versus whether this is about something bigger than that. And it's about territorial integrity. It's about reuniting, the Chinese homeland and trying to reestablish, this vision of China, even if the Hong Kong's financial status is diminished in some way, and it doesn't bring that benefit to China, that the other benefits are therefore worth it, and they're willing to make that trade-off.
So this is a good segue to talk about Taiwan, right? Is this China's posturing to send a message to Taiwan? Are they trying to tell the world that this is how we view this region, this is how we want to run this region, and this region is ours? Is that the message here?
I think all of this is related, right? And again, I think back to this initial discussion, why now? I think there are some that would say, Beijing would have done this and taken a much tougher position in 1984 or 1997 if it had the capacity to do so. But it's a much stronger country right now. It can throw its weight around, and it can push for changes in a way that it couldn't do 25 years ago. What does this mean for Taiwan? I mean, I think it's a fascinating question, and certainly one that the Taiwanese are watching very, very carefully.
Very, very carefully.
Yeah, and I don't know. I think I think this is certainly the idea that these protests could go somewhat unchecked, or that just this kind of instability, or the kind of chaos that the Hong Kong authorities were describing would go on indefinitely. Was certainly problematic. It was certainly a distraction for Beijing. It was not a conversation they wanted to keep having. Last year they really wanted to focus on the 70th anniversary of the PRC, and they were really worried about these protests in Hong Kong, diverting tension away from that, which they did. There were two main stories in the newspaper that day. One was the 70th anniversary. One was the big protests in Hong Kong. So I think they are aware of the fact that everyone's watching, and that they don't really like having all this instability happening kind of under their umbrella and on their watch. Now, Taiwan is obviously very different in that there aren't protests in the streets on a daily basis. Their relationship with Beijing is obviously very different. But I think they're also making quite clear that should Taiwan step too far in terms of asserting independence, declaring independence, that Beijing would be very quick to act. Now, I think if that were to happen in a Taiwan scenario, it would be much more than introducing a new law and police brutality. I mean, it would be military action, and it would be quite devastating. So, but there are certainly parallels in terms of trying to send a signal to the people in Taiwan, but also to other parts of China, which are somewhat contested right now, where there's some tension between the local communities and the government, and trying to remind them that Beijing is in control, and Beijing will do what it needs to do to stay in control.
So this segues into a question that's, I think, more of a topical discussion between you and I. But as you know, there are many companies in Michigan, in West Michigan, that have operations in Hong Kong. And this security law can be interpreted in a variety of different ways. Should the owners of companies that have operation subsidiaries in Hong Kong fear retribution to them personally as owners of entities? Let's say one of their employees makes political statements that are unfavorable or does something that can be seen as terrorism or subversion. Do you think that China has the will to utilize this security law to travel through entities to owners of these companies here in the United States?
So the very end of your question, does China have the will to do what to the enters of the United States?
Do you think they have the will to utilize a security law to come after owners of subsidiaries with U.S. companies, Michigan-based companies with subsidiaries in Hong Kong?
Mm-hmm. I think it's hard to say, and I think I'd be curious to hear your views on this, because I'm sure you've been thinking about this from the business perspective a lot more than I have from the peace building side of things. But again, I think it gives Beijing a tool and leverage that it can use and draw upon when needed. So I think, there are a number of laws in place in mainland China that, for the most part aren't, strictly enforced in a lot of ways on a day-to-day basis, but that the government can use when it needs to send a signal or respond to something. And I think, for example, the detention of the two Canadians, Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig, would fall into that category, where Beijing, according to the laws on the books, could conceivably do that to foreigners, every day, but it doesn't. It was something that kind of kept in its back pocket until it needed to send a message and respond to the Canadian arrest of the Huawei executive. And so I think it's partly like being in the wrong place at the wrong time, I think, in a lot of ways, where if your company happens to have done something at a time when Beijing needs to send a message of strength or disapproval or retribution in response to something else, then it's certainly something that they could do, and certainly a risk that you would take. But I think it's really hard to tell at this point how consistently that might be enforced and how exactly they might implement some of those measures along the way. But yeah, what do you think? How are you thinking about this from the business side?
I think that business people should take it seriously. I mean, I think that there can be retribution from China, and I think China can interpret this law to however they want to. And so if I had an operation in Hong Kong and I had employees that were doing things that could be seen as unsavory in the eyes of China, I would try and stop it, because I think they could flow through. We actually have several questions coming in from the audience about the Hong Kong education system and the universities. That are they going to be affected? Are the NGOs, are the reputations of the universities in Hong Kong going to be affected by this? And what is their path forward?
That's a good question. And again, I think another factor that hasn't really been sorted out yet. This certainly has been discussion. It's something that I've seen discussions on this in academic circles in terms of professors and administrators and students in Hong Kong wondering what this means for them, wondering what this means for not just freedom of speech, but for their research agendas, for their freedom to teach the curriculum that they want in the schools, and how much control Beijing is going to try to have over the content of what's taught, what's said in the classroom, and some of these things that you're hearing now coming out of the mainland, where people are really being watched carefully and made to really toe the party line, and whether that will similarly kind of emerge in Hong Kong. I think it's probably too soon to say at this point. I have heard from a number of administrators at universities in Hong Kong who have spoken publicly about this and said, as far as they know, they are operating under the same rules as before, and they continue to promote, freedom of thought, freedom of inquiry, freedom of speech in their classrooms and in their work. And if at any point that becomes endangered, then they will speak up and really push back against that. So, but I think I don't know. I don't have a good answer to that yet. And I think this school year there will likely be some some interesting case studies of places where perhaps they have tried to implement parts of this or rein in certain classes or certain professors in certain ways. But yeah, it'll be interesting to watch. Have you heard anything more about the university system or how this is playing out there?
I have not, but it is a very interesting question. I'm glad the audience brought it up. One other question. So China has a long memory. We all know that, right? And one of the questions from our audience is centered around an era of humiliation, watching Hong Kong succeed while it's under British control. And, is this some sort of tit for tat retribution for that era of humiliation? I thought I would ask the question as it came in from the audience.
It's a great question, and it's something that comes up a lot. I mean, I think it's certainly a concept that a lot of people are familiar with. It's something that's mentioned a lot in Chinese literature and Chinese analysis of China's role in the world and China's foreign policy and grand strategy and what kind of country it wants to be. So much of that, as I'm sure whether it's formal statements or just kind of casual conversations. There's a lot of reference back to Century of Humiliation and what that means for China and its objectives today. How much that actually plays out in terms of foreign policy decisions, I don't know. I think China has really grown so much over the last 20 years and has really started to flex its muscle in so many different ways. My sense is it's kind of moved beyond that, and that may still be a driving factor in kind of the historical analysis and certainly a formative in the formative years of a lot of the people who are leading now. I don't know how much that actually affects day-to-day decisions. I think China right now is learning how to wield its heightened power and in many ways learning as it goes and trying to take advantage of its strength and take advantage of its comparative advantages. But sometimes it pushes a little too hard, sometimes it goes a little too far, and then it kind of course corrects and adjusts. But my sense is it's driven much more by really these forward-looking, these forward thinking goals that Xi Jinping has set out for where he wants to see the country go in the next 10, 20, 30 years. And that is really more the vision as opposed to kind of the backward reflection.
I agree. So just to remind everybody, again, if you have a question, please type it in your YouTube comments, or you can text it to Emily at 616-308-6560. But yeah, Jennifer, it's sad. I lived in Hong Kong for many years, pre and post handover, and immediately after the handover, the changes weren't significant. But after I returned to the United States, watching the changes transpire in Hong Kong were disheartening. I mean, it is a unique place, as you said earlier. It was the epicenter of trade in the Pearl River Delta. And you would like it to see the epicenter remain and be the epicenter of trade and finance, going forward within the Pearl River. I do honestly feel that China has plans, long-term plans for Shanghai, and that will transpire over many years. Given the history of Shanghai in the financial arena, I think that China feels it has a place in the future within the financial arena. One last question, and it relates to US IP. What role do you guys play politically, either interacting with our government, our politicians, or the Chinese politicians, or the Hong Kong legislature? How do you tie into the whole mosaic, and how do you kind of weave it all together?
No, thanks. That's a good question. We have not been working specifically on this Hong Kong issue, partly because of the mandate, but also just the way that we're structured, and we're a relatively small organization and we can't work on everything all the time. One of the things that we have really been looking at, and the way that we have been looking at this Hong Kong issue is through some of our broader work on the power of what we call people power and peaceful protests. And some of the research that's been done showing that really peaceful protests and peaceful oppositions are far more effective in the long term than violent ones. And there's some really interesting research that's been done across cultures, across time, to show why that is. And so that's been partly what we have been really focused on is, in terms of conversations with people involved in the tensions in Hong Kong or, on the outside trying to help, just really trying to encourage people to keep things peaceful, because when the riots get violent, or when the police get violent, when the students get violent, when the protesters get violent, that's when most of this seems to really get off track, and I think everyone is less likely to end up where they want it to be. We, in terms of our relationship with the U.S. government, as I said, we occupy kind of a strange space, actually, in that we are a national institute and we are 100% government funded, but we are not part of the government. So we were created by Congress, we are funded by Congress, we work very closely with the State Department, with USAID, with the Defense Department, and with embassies around the world, but we're not part of the executive branch or the legislative branch. So we work very closely with them, but we do so with that space of independence, so that we can go talk to people in other countries and around the world independently, where we're not bound by U.S. policies, we're not bound by the talking points that might constrain an official U.S. diplomat or U.S. official in some way, which gives us a little more space to engage on some creative thinking and really trying to get people, give people the space to think a little bit outside of the official government policy, to try to consider some new, creative, innovative ways to, unstick a problem and move forward in a way that's going to be palatable to everyone. So we certainly work very closely with our colleagues in the U.S. government, but it's actually kind of interesting that we're able to take a few steps back, because that allows us to do things that honestly it's very hard for them to do, and in a way that I think is hard to do if you're a U.S. official. But happy to talk more about that on the specific side. But we meet with and we talk with officials in Beijing all the time. We talk with experts in China in various ways to try to understand better how they're viewing different problems, whether it's Hong Kong or conflicts in Burma or Afghanistan, recent conversations about tensions in South Asia and other types of issues, to really try to understand better how they're assessing the problem, what their priorities are, what their policy objectives are, and seeing if there's perhaps some misunderstandings along the way, perhaps some shared common ground that wasn't immediately apparent at the outset, and really just trying to get a better sense of where everybody is, and seeing if we can, again, as I said, generate some new ideas and some creative ways forward.
So with that, it looks like we're approaching, we're actually over our hour now. So Jennifer, I'd like to say thank you for doing this. I really appreciate this. And I would like to remind everybody out there that this will be archived on YouTube. If you find somebody that might be interested in this presentation, please share the link. And at the World Affairs Council West Michigan, we plan on continuing to provide you programming during days of physical distancing. On Tuesday, October 13th at 7 p.m., we'll be hosting P.W. Singer, strategist, author, and book in the book Like War, The Weaponization of Social Media. So we'd love for you to join us on that. With that, I would like to say thank you to the audience. And again, thank you to the colleagues at World Affairs Council of West Michigan for putting this together. And Jennifer, thank you. When you come and visit your sister in Holland, please come see me. I'm right down the road in Saugatuck. So I'd love to say hello.